Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Nammour Symposium. Today we're going to have a faculty panel of professors here at Sac State in our philosophy department, and in the afternoon we're going to have student paper presentations and poster sessions. So please join us for all of that. Our first talk this morning is by Professor Matt McCormick, and the talk is entitled MachineMinds, a Plan for Conscious AI. Will you join me in welcoming Matt McCormick?
I'm going to suggest something that I hope you will find outrageous and that I can half convince you of. Oh, good, I'm already out. All right, second slide. All right, this is actually my first slide. These days, I'm going to make I'd like to talk about conscious AI. And I think one of the best ways to sort of tackle this problem, because I want to build one, I know everybody else is worried about it. I think one of the best ways to tackle this problem is to look to humans and draw some lessons from neuroscience about how human consciousness is built. And on the philosophical side, theories of mind in philosophy that are drawing heavily from neuroscience are giving us some fine structural detail about what your consciousness is like, and that's making suggestions for how we should build the machines to be in some ways like us, in other ways not like us. So let me jump back and forth between philosophy, neuroscience, and computer science, only one of which I know anything about. Okay, so these days in neuroscience, people are using this word. You may start hearing it, called the connectome. The connectome is a comprehensive mapping of all the neural connections in the brain. It's a sort of wiring diagram. Now, we're not anywhere near being able to produce one of these for 83 billion neurons that have 5 to 50,000 dendritic connections each, but we're getting some big sort of macro level mapping in place, and it's getting better every year. And the idea is that the more we understand about the neurophysiology of the pathways, the connections in the brain, the more we understand the fine detail about human consciousness. And then I want to bring some of those lessons over for the AI question. So what you're the proud owner of is known as a PDP, or Parallel Distributed Processing Network, that has shifting connection weights. And we heard about some of this yesterday from Scott Gordon in the computer science department, and I'm going to hit on some of the same points. The developments in artificial intelligence in computer science in the last 15 or 20 years, we've just had this revolution because of this, because we've started building artificial neural networks that are fundamentally different than the way you may have thought about computer programming and computer architecture from the 20th century. And what's important about these is that these artificial neural networks are modeled after human neurons. So there's nodes that are connected, and they have connection weights that are either excitatory, where they amplify the connection, or they're inhibitory, where they reduce the connection. And in effect, this is a very small, simple model of a human brain, where we've got inputs on one side, lots of hidden layer nodes that then filter through all this information and have outputs on the other end. So in artificial neural networks, the idea is that we've mimicked the layout, the learning, and the growth of neural nets. They adapt, they change, they shift in their connection weights with new experience. There's a lot to be said here, and maybe some of this will come out in the question and answer period. But if you're thinking about AI in a kind of old-fashioned sense, you might be thinking about it this way. You might be thinking about serial processing, where a programmer writes code with instructions that say, if you get this input, then you go to this subroutine, and then within that subroutine, you use your data and you crunch ka-chunk, 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 one at a time. You crunch through that data and you alter, and you serially run through a bunch of computations and then spit out an output on the other side. Well, one of the fundamental differences about artificial neural networks and with brains is that there's massive parallel distributed processing going on. So we've got a huge number of input connections, where there's simultaneously lots of inputs coming in, And then the work that's being done on that is distributed widely across a net, and we're not looking at any sort of single serial process the way we used to do it, the way we used to think about it with code, and then spitting out the output. So the behavior and the properties and the performance of this thing ends up being really importantly different than it is in the old way we built AI systems. And we are seeing a bunch of new capacities emerge out of these kinds of computer architectures that had stumped, or we had hit kind of an upper limit in computer science of what they could accomplish until this sort of revolution happened. You might be excited to know that this revolution happened because of graphics cards for video games. It turns out that the increasing technology that made maybe you've got an NVIDIA graphic card in your computer that cost you $800 so that you can run the latest version of Far Cry or whatever. Turns out that Google has figured out, and lots of other companies have figured out, how to slave hundreds and thousands of those together in parallel structures and have them run parallel PDP processing. So it's your video games that are going to, or at least the video game technology that's ushering in the new AI era, and made all this possible. Okay, so the shift here then is to parallel distributed sub-symbolic processing. And I'll come back to that in a minute, I think. Seems to have unlocked the door to building machines that can perceive, learn, and possibly even think like humans. Let's see if I can convince you of that. Okay, so let me give a kind of high-view functional map of consciousness in humans. And I'm going to tease it out. Here's some of the neuroscience. I'm going to tease this out, and you're going to hear some of this from our student panel this afternoon, too. But I'm going to tease out some distinctions. And really, there's a lot on here, but really what I want you to focus on is, at the top, we've got perception, attention, and awareness. So consciousness is this sort of, a wildly ambiguous term that we use in all these different contexts and lots of different forms of speech. And I'm going to tease out what I think will probably be familiar to you, and I'm going to call these specific things perception, attention, and awareness. So let's start with perception. Perception's easy. In humans, you've got a sensory periphery. You've got a sensory apparatus that takes up information about your environment. It's your five senses. And some of this becomes available or becomes attended by you, or you become aware of it, and some of it you don't. So take a second. This is my favorite example. Listen to the HVAC system blowing air in this room. Everybody hear that? So we just moved that from merely perceived, because I'm assuming that everybody's ears were working well enough, even before I brought your attention to that, your ears were working well enough that that sound of that air blowing in that vent up there was registering in your system. It was being attended to by some low-level discriminatory processes. Some neural nets were working on that, and they knew that was going on. They knew, in some loose sense. And when I brought your attention to it, what happened was there was a boosting of cognitive resources in your brain that focused on that and dedicated some more work to it, made it available in one sense. So for me, that information about that HVAC system blowing became available to a lot of my other neural net systems so that I could talk about it. So it's now available to speech centers, and I'm waving my hands, so there's motor center connections. And now maybe I'm going to remember that I talked about it. I remember the fact that I've done this before, and there's people who've heard me say this before. I'm making this connection to me being boring as a speaker. So using my same old example then, that moved from merely perceived at the low level, which may or may not, in other cases, move up to the attended level, where it gets a boosting of cognitive resources that are dedicated to it. And then at that point, the motor cortex, short-term memory, long-term memory, speech, planning, imagination, all sorts of other systems, if we can call them that, sort of on a high functional level, can then access to and do some work on that information. And that can happen for all sorts of things. My other example that I always love is you have vertical edge detectors in your visual cortex that have been processing that edge on that screen. And there's actually some neurons down there in your V1 that have been buzzing like crazy this whole 10 minutes about that vertical edge. And nobody's been paying attention to them. Nobody else in your brain, no other neurons have done any work on that. Those little neurons have been buzzing and going, hey, there's a vertical edge, there's a vertical edge. This guy's going, this is my job, this is what I do. I'm here for vertical edges, and there's one right there. And so now I've moved that up to the attended level, and now you're thinking about it. And maybe you'll remember it, probably not. See if I can force this into long-term memory. So that's moved from merely perceived up to attended. So the notion here, and this is from Dehane and Nakache and a number of other neuroscientists and philosophers of mind, is that there's a kind of global availability of this low-level process, and it's moved out to these other processes. Okay, this is going to be useful to us when we start thinking about AI in a minute. Okay, so we've got perception, and then attention is where you devote some more cognitive resources to it, and you're able to do more with it. And then the really interesting, philosophically, profound level of consciousness here we ought to think about is awareness. I'm just going to call it awareness, and what I mean by that is something like metacognition. So I can do three things. I can first just perceive the vertical edge. Second, I can attend to it, and it becomes a sort of focus of my cognitive resources. And then third, I can put me into the picture. I am currently thinking about vertical edges. So there's a lot going on in that sentence. There's much more. My example in this case is you just have a mere sensation of a ball, and versus you can say that that's a ball when you've got access to speech centers, and then you can put yourself into the relationship and say, I saw the ball. I'm in possession of ball information, or I'm in possession of a ball representation. And there's a lot to be said about what's going on at the C2 or awareness level, but we could, and there's a lot to be said more about the AI connection, but first off, there's just self-attribution. There's not just sort of ball representation happening, it's that I have put myself into an epistemic relationship with that representation, and I've put myself there as holding the information. So that's a big deal philosophically to do that. And it's also what allows me that capacity is that I recognize about myself that I'm thinking about it, but I also recognize that you guys are thinking about it. Like I'm attending to and attributing awareness to people in the room. I'm assuming that when I called your attention to, and I'll try to use these deliberately now, when I called your attention to the HVAC system, or when I called your attention to the to the vertical edge, now perhaps it's moved into your awareness. Like there are awarenesses in the room. Now that's a thing I can do, is I can distinguish between objects in the room that have awareness and things that don't. The chairs aren't perceiving, they're not attending, and they're not aware, but the things sitting in the chairs, at least some of them, are perceiving, attending, and perhaps even aware, where they can put themselves into this kind of epistemic relationship, and I'm attributing that to you. Now that's a very fancy capacity, to be able to recognize about some objects that they have awareness or they have attention. So, for example, I'm going to get to the AI discussion in more detail in a second, but you may have Alexa in your house, or you may have the Google Home system in your house. And it may even, at some rudimentary level, do those recognize different people in the house by your voice? So it might even be able to call you by name. But that's a really low level, at best, sort of perceived, maybe attended kind of representation. What's going to be really cool, or maybe terrifying, is when you can build an AI system that fully attributes attention and awareness to you. So maybe it can correctly identify everybody in the family by their voice, but once the AI can model you as an attender or an awareness, then it can start developing and filling out a model of what do you know, what do you not know, what would you like to know, what are your preferences, and so on. I mean, Google can do this sort of thing now, but it's done at a very low level, sort of associative, done at an associative level, but modeling a mind is a completely different ball game, which I'm going to get to in a second. All right, so let's build up an AI system, or at least let's build up what it would take and look at what we've got. So currently, AI perception at the first level, AI perception got really, really good. the revolution with PDP networks, with artificial neural networks, has blown open visual recognition tasks. This was a logjam for decades because the technology wasn't sufficient. The theory was out there. Connectionist theory was out there way back into the 20th century, but it's only been in the last 20 years or so that we have had the technology to really do the testing and really do the development. So lots of these tasks, like there's a famous set of numbers where they're handwritten numbers and they all have different sort of slightly different styles. And it's been a sort of long-standing problem in computer science, visual recognition tasks, to get a system to successfully recognize, you know, if I have everybody in the room write a 4, it's got lots of little differences about your handwriting. And we're all very good at that, or at least for the most part. Many of my students, I can't read their writing at all. But for the most part, people in the room can look at 50 different 4s and correctly identify those as 4s. It's been very hard to get computer systems to do that until we've had this, moved into this new revolution, this new technological capacity. And not only that, we've gotten to the level where we've got very good capacity to recognize objects. I had to include some skin lesions. The AI system's gotten very good at doing things like recognizing skin lesions. Dermatologists are soon to be out of business because an app on your phone can do a much better job at identifying what's going on with that mole. And it doesn't cost nearly as much and doesn't take an appointment and all this time going to the doctor. And the same for radiologists. They're soon to be out of business because the AI systems do a much better job at correctly identifying what's going on with the X-ray. So ANN systems now frequently exceed human perceptual and identification abilities. And I want to maintain, I think this is debatable, but recognizing objects could be a precursor or an early form of actual conceptual possession and use. It might be that at the lower level, being able to recognize all those 4s amounts to possessing a concept of 4. Now, if you're a Platonist, you won't go for this, but you know, a hardcore sort of naturalist computer scientist might maintain, what else is it to have the capacity or have the concept of 4 than to be able to recognize the application of 4 in all these different contexts. All right, so those are fighting words, and we can have that fight in a bit. And I'll just show you just very briefly, here's a kind of neat visualization of the way that a bunch of different styled PDP networks that have different structures actually do the 4, 5, in this case it's 9 recognition. So what you're going to see here is a graphic that illustrates the way, here's the idea. We've got a 3D representation of a neural net, artificial neural net. And on one side, on the input side, there's a bunch of different 9s, I think it is, that are coming in on, you know, say the eyeball side. And then the information is filtered through the network, and the system is then identifying, well, which number is that I just got confronted with? And I'll run it for just a few seconds, and you can see sort of the thing filtering through the system. One thing that's interesting here that I think is different about what I've got to say today than what you heard yesterday or what you might think about is that this is sub-symbolic processing. Nowhere down in this network is a 9. There's not a clear modular, functional, discrete concept of 9. 9 is widely distributed. It's smeared across all these different nodes. It's not as if there's clearly identifiable logic or decisions or words going on down at that level. Those capacities emerge at the output side. And this has been one of the debates in philosophy of mind about what should we expect to find down in there when we get under the hood in a mind. Should we expect to find logic down there somehow? Because logic is one of the things you can do. You can draw logical inferences on the output side. You're very good at that, perhaps. You're very good at identifying 9s. So should we find a 9 built in there somehow in some sort of, you know, robustly, recognizably 9 sense down in there? And the answer coming from connectionism and the answer coming from recent work in AI is no. It's all sub-symbolic down there. So you're not going to find, this is a bit like Leibniz's mill problem. You're not going to find the idea down there. The idea comes out at the top side. Oh, of course, it doesn't work. Let's see if I can get it to work. After all that setup, I damn well better show it, huh? There we go, a little bit. It's not very, can you see that? You can see it, okay. All right, so here's at the input side, these different handwritten numbers. And what they're doing in computer science these days is finding different configurations of these neural networks that you're sort of looking at, in a sense, here. They're finding different configurations and different algorithms for training these things up, and then testing and checking their performance to see how good they are. So you've got, you know, a variety of different architectures within the notion of building an artificial neural network. So sometimes they're layered, and there's some other really interesting ones going on here. And you get different capacities out of these when you construct the network in different ways. Which I think, this is arguable, but I think it's very suggestive about what could come next when we start wondering about natural language processing and lots of other much more sophisticated capacities. All right, I'll stop there and then press on. Okay, so what about harder conceptual or natural language processing? So far, artificial neural networks can recognize numbers. They're very good with objects. They're very good with words. You may have this creepy sense when you're typing in a sentence into Google, a request. I don't even finish my sentences anymore. I just type a few words and let Google do it for me. I'll let you decide whether that's a bad sign. Parse complicated questions. It can figure out what you want long before you state it. Oops, sorry. So a good question in the background then, and one of the questions we worry about in philosophy of mind is, what will be required for an artificial neural network system to process natural language in conversations? So you've been processing natural language all this time, assuming you've been understanding my English sentences, and assuming you've been following me for the most part, you've been doing a really complicated task here. This is not just noticing a handwritten 9. This is you sort of figuring out what McCormick is talking about. This is you keeping track of the sentence that I started a few seconds ago and that I'm finishing now. And you scrolling all of that together and then threading that sentence together with the previous sentence and with what I started by saying 10 minutes ago. So you're doing a much more cohesive, comprehensive job of building a little bubble of understanding about what's going on, right? So that's a vastly more complicated ability. And to be able to have a conversation, to be able to follow somebody's train of thought, to be able to ask a question about what they're talking about, to have them listen to you and go back and forth, right? So classically, we worried about this with the Turing test, that the test of a truly conscious AI system would be one that could successfully pass itself off in one of those contexts. So the suggestion here, and some people will say that we're not going to be able to do it, but the suggestion here is that this ANN revolution is going to open the door to being able to build more and more sophisticated systems with more capacity, and that those are going to be more or less more of the same. Being able to do all of that is going to be built out of these smaller, simpler parts. So what will be required for them to be conscious in a more recognizably human sense? And here, by conscious, what I'm getting at is this answer, and here's sort of my outrageous thesis. The answer is build them with awareness or metacognition. So you recall my diagram of the human mind and my calling your attention to perception, attention, and awareness. So awareness is a crucial piece of the puzzle here that I want to get at. Okay, so what is that? So we can recognize and attribute attention. I was doing that when I look around the room and I see where your eyes are pointing, and I see you look at your notes or look at your the notepad on your lap. You look back at the screen and you look at me. I take it you're paying attention. You're devoting more cognitive resources to what's happening, what's coming out of my mouth, than you currently are paying to the HVAC system, although I just ruined it. So I can recognize and attribute attention to you. I might notice she's concentrating on playing that video game. we can recognize and attribute awareness itself as a property in some objects, including ourselves. Okay, so there's two different abilities here. The first one is just, I notice you're attending to something, but I also can take note of your awareness itself. So not merely that you're paying more attention to something, but that you can do this self-reflexive, self-referential thing. You can say something like, I am hungry, or I need more coffee. And I can recognize about this object in the room that it's got awareness. It's got this sort of meta-cognitive ability. So there's a couple ways to think about this. And what I want to suggest is that building AI systems with awareness is the next big challenge. It might be such a big challenge that we can't do it, but I think we're making some serious headway if I understand what's going on in computer science right. And I think that I might be completely off base, but I think that philosophers of mind can offer some help here. At least that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I think human AI capabilities will leap forward dramatically when they can model some objects like humans and themselves, that is the AI systems, as epistemic agents, as minds, as representational systems. And I'll just kind of blur the differences between all those together for now. But I'll make some sense of what I mean by epistemic agent here in a second. Okay, so let's talk about that notion of awareness. Awareness allows the construction of models. Probably attention does too, but let's think of it this way. A mental model is an internal representation or construct that can be inspected or even run in some way. Features of the model can then be transformed back into inferred or predicted features of the world. So think about what you do in these kinds of cases. What would happen if I pushed this laptop off the table? Maybe that made your eyes dilate a little bit, made you stress. If I could do it, here, I'll do it. Watch this. Yeah, now everybody's got your attention, didn't I? So you're all stressed about this, right? Is he actually gonna drop that? I'm not gonna, but I got your attention. You were successfully modeling what would happen next. Like you ran through and pictured me letting that thing go and watching it shatter into pieces onto the floor. So that was you building a world in your head, representing a bunch of causal relationships, and you've got these expectations that are built on the other things you know about the behavior of objects in the world. And you ran that out in imagination. You pictured all the possible ways that could go, perhaps. It went this way. I put it back on the table. But you pictured or imagined it running out the other way where I smashed the laptop. So that's you building a really sophisticated internal representation, not just of sort of the object at one moment, but of possible causal futures. And the more elaborate capacity here is you being able to model somebody's awareness. Like, what's he thinking? Why would he want to do that? What would he be possibly trying to prove? What would happen if I asked her out for a date is another one. And this is a case where you're explicitly modeling the other person's mind. Like, would she say yes? Would she laugh at me scornfully? Would we walk and hold hands on the beach at sunset? So now I'm modeling not just the simple sort of dumb, unintelligent object smashing the computer, but now I'm modeling another person and what they want, what their goals are, whether she's filled with scorn or whether she wants to have a romantic walk on the beach. Okay, so C2 modeling for humans lets us do some pretty fancy stuff. That picture, again, is already conveying a whole bunch of information to you that AI systems can't do yet. C2, this awareness level, this third category I wanted to talk about, is more complicated than mere kitten recognition, of which the internet's full. It entails representing my own mind, becoming aware that the representation is a representation in my system. I am thinking about the HVAC system, or Trump, or whatever. And here's where the philosophers can help. The intentional stance is what it's been called for decades, is a kind of approach. It's a way to understand the behavior of objects. And it's a framework to put on a way to describe certain things you're observing. That if you adopt this modeling heuristic, it turns out that data structures for AI, or just the sorts of things you're observing as a human, can be usefully labeled as having minds. They have beliefs, they have goals, they have plans, they have desires. And all of those are part of the intentional stance, introducing these ideas, a mind, a belief, a goal, a plan, a desire. It's a kind of shorthand way for me to quickly parse out all these different futures and attribute certain kinds of properties to these objects I'm trying to figure out what they are doing, what they're going to do next. If I'm going to ask somebody out on a date, it's very useful for me to be able to identify their behavior in terms of goals, plans, desires, and it's a very short, handy way, computationally, for me to make predictions about what they're going to do. It lets us explain complex behaviors. And it amounts to, in some ways, modeling attention itself. Okay, so modeling minds then lets you do something like Trump feels angry about the reporter. You can infer this about the internal states of this mind. Trump is thinking the reporter is wrong. Trump believes that the reporter should sit down. Doesn't he know that he's going to get in trouble, this reporter? I remember feeling apprehension with the reporter. They're both paying close attention. These are all things that I can do by adopting the attentional stance, and I can parse out a really complicated set of behaviors here that for an AI would just recognize two humans or not be able to do, not be very sensitive to all of this. But by introducing the concept of mind, belief, goals, desires, etc., I'm able to make fast work of an otherwise, exceedingly difficult computational problem. It lets me parse out the world with a kind of cartoon. We model both of their minds, we model their beliefs, their goals, their plans, their knowledge, their attention, as well as that's a blue tie. That's the simple sort of attended level cognitive task. But attributing minds and beliefs and goals to them is a very new and a very powerful set of cognitive tools. So my suggestion is that when we come up with effective or powerful ways to build that into an AI system, now we've got a candidate for something that's resembling or much more like having human attention. All right, so let me come at this from a couple of slightly different angles. The C2 modeling lets me model worlds within worlds. So when I say, or when I am currently thinking about a burrito, that's got a whole bunch of objects in it. It's got a real burrito, it's got a thought burrito, it's got a mind that thinks burritos, and that mind is me. And I'm able to distinguish all of those because I know that I'm thinking about a burrito, but I know there's not a real burrito here. So I'm keeping track of complicated, different representations, some of which are just ideas or fantasies or imaginations because I'm hungry, and some of which are real, and I'm parsing out these different worlds. So there's a real world versus the thought world that I'm able to separate. There's a representation in here that may or may not map onto what's out there. And those worlds can be different. I can be wrong about there being a burrito in front of me. My representation being different from the real thing might diverge. It might be different. It might be mistaken. I might see what I think is the lake in the distance on the highway, but it turns out to just be the heat rising from the pavement. You all have seen these sorts of examples, so this is the wrong time of year for it. I'm able to recognize that that just looks like water on the street, on the highway, but know that it's not actually. And I maintain that this C2 level modeling is part of what lets us make that distinction. About mistakes. Okay, so the secret key to conscious AI then is to build C2 into it. So currently AI systems are pretty good at recognizing simple objects, but they can't really model these other fancier capacities. Imagine that we build an intentionality module into an AI system that monitors and reports on the state of the ANN network itself. So then you could ask questions like this: what is the system currently dedicating its resources to? And the AI system could say, I am thinking about the Dow Jones Index, versus an AI system that just does it. This is one that can do the task and it can report about its own situation, its own state, or what it's doing. It keeps track of what sorts of things it's dedicating its resources to. The same module could represent other minds and their contents, and it could answer questions like, what is he thinking about? What are you thinking about? What is he thinking about? Okay, so let me parse out two different kinds of self-representation now and separate this epistemic agency from epistemic awareness from spatial awareness. So we might think of AI systems as having exterior self-modeling. That is, the agent modeled itself as a physical object, and this is actually easy. We're very good at this. All your phones, my phone does this. This is just to locate yourself within a spatial temporal framework. So your phone just pings the cell tower and gets a GPS location, and your phone can place itself within a few meters of where it is on a global positioning system. So self-modeling in that sense is trivial. It's easy. It's easy and common. But the kind of self-modeling that I've been sort of directing our attention to is this notion of an interior self-model. The agent modeled itself as an information processing system. So consider the difference between the AI system being able to keep track of the fact that it has its fingers on its head versus it's being able to model that it's thinking. And the modeling its own thinking is a vastly more difficult sort of system to build, but it's also incredibly more powerful, and that's going to be when we get make this sort of leap forward in these capacities. All right, I'll come at it one more angle. MachineMinds requires structuring variables associated with presence or absence of beliefs, goals, desires, and of self and of others having their own models of the world that are informing their decisions. So I've been suggesting that this intentionality, the intentional stance, is going to give us some leverage into solving this problem. So imagine that when beyond what Alexa can do now or your Google Home can do now, when they can start modeling this, what does she want? Think about want for a minute and how complicated that is, what sorts of attributions I have to do to make sense of wanting. And I have to attribute beliefs to her. Food will satisfy hunger. She's got goals. She'll seek out food, so she wants a burrito. That requires me, or requires the artificial intelligence system to be able to do those kinds of attributions. Okay. One more suggestion that I'll make for the Q&A discussion. There's a good bit of really interesting research going on here where computer scientists are converging on some things that philosophers have been working on and wondering about for a long time. This, in particular, this makes me think about Kant. The suggestion recently coming out of some computer science journals, if I understand right, is that, look, our current artificial neural networks are built flat, they're empty, and they often employ somewhat random. Yesterday we had a mention of the Monte Carlo search strategy. I'll just leave it at that for now. Random search strategies to navigate through decision space. It looks like, and some people in computer science are suggesting, that artificial neural network performance or learning or capacities could be sped up, could be improved by biasing some pathways and favoring some paths or some connection weights over others that would give them some a boost. Here, let me. Sorry, I'm making a mess of this. I'm modeling what I've said and what I'm trying to get into your heads. The artificial neural networks of the sort I showed you in the video, the really simple one that was able to successfully identify the nines or the numbers, is built without any intrinsic or handcrafted nine recognition capacity in it until you turn it on and you train it up, and you train up the weights of all the nodes, and then it gets better and better with feedback on correctly identifying nines. But that network wasn't lumpy. It was homogeneous at the outset, and the values of all the connection weights may well have been set to random values. And then the algorithm that was used to train it would tweak those values until it gets better and better and better at correctly identifying numbers. So one of the suggestions about boosting AI performance now that I'm finding in some really interesting articles is that rather than build these things flat and empty and without being lumpy at all, maybe we ought to build them lumpy. Maybe we ought to build them with some structures already innately present in them, the way human babies are born. So human babies, for instance, have got what psychologists call a very powerful intuitive psychology. Very early on, human babies already appear to be biasing their perceptions in terms of agents who have goals and desires, they're good and they're bad. And these capacities or these distinctions are showing up in babies so early that the idea is that this is a kind of innate or a priori disposition that they've already got present. And the same goes for physics. So building an AI system that's already primed or already biased in favor physical behavior of objects would give it a boost up or a leg up in understanding the real world when we actually turn it on. I'll leave it at that and see if that comes up again in the question and answer session. Okay, so one more interesting suggestion then, using my basic taxonomy about perception, attention, and awareness. Here's an interesting bit of food for thought, I think. If that's the way human consciousness is built, then the door appears to be open for us to build AI consciousness, but build it really different than us. So maybe we could change the ways in which it perceives. There's a wide range or a wide array of different kinds of sensory uptake it could have. It could be any sort of electrical signals. It could be EM radiation across the spectrum. It could be any information-bearing medium. It could be tapped into the electrical grid for the country the way you're tapped into where your big toes are right now. So that could be feeding into something that's like an AI attention module, where it devotes increased computational resources to it. And then that could be fed out to all sorts of things, memory, planning, association, synthesis, problem solving. So I've made the list a little bit different here. But we can imagine AI boosting its computational resources to do any number of things at the attention level, and then having these capacities at the metacognitive level to be able to do error correction, to attach credence or confidence to its judgments, to do reality monitoring like you do with your burrito, and to do self-improvement, which is the really pregnant suggestion here for the AI apocalypse you're all worried about. Okay, so my outrageous theses. Humans have perception, attention, and awareness. That's a useful way to understand consciousness. Building machines with awareness will endow them with minds. I think it's maybe a necessary condition, not sufficient, and make them conscious, but I'll just put it the simple way. Adopting the intentional stance from philosophy of mind could solve the computational problems of such complex modeling. Freed from the limitations of human cognitive systems, AI minds can be radically different. End program.
Minutes or so for questions.
There's microphones coming to you, so.
All right, so you said that you can change the way that the AI perceive. Could this technology kind of like in theory change the way humans perceive? Can we alter the consciousness of like a normal human being, or ones that maybe aren't capable of?
The cyborg question.
Yeah.
So an obvious, interesting set of questions, inquiries here is, what are the ways in which we might change humans? And maybe the easiest way, I mean, we're already doing this when you put cochlear implants into somebody who's been deaf from birth, or otherwise finding some technological solution to on the input side. So that's already happening. I guess I'm a little bit, I'm convinced, I think, provisionally by Nick Bostrom's argument about the difficulties of a really deep level interface here, because silicon circuitry and silicon technology is so different in its density and the way it works from the human nerves that a really deep, profound cyborg connection at the attention or awareness level strikes me as being technologically super hard because of the way human meat works, and the way it's shaped, and the way that electrical signals get communicated across synaptic junctions isn't really amenable to silicon circuitry connections. But I don't know. I mean, there's lots of room here. And there's people working on it. So, yeah, this is all suggestive about ways in which we could be improved. Jason.
It seems like part of the best explanation for why our scientific theories make good predictions is that they're glomming onto real things in the world like atoms and molecules and all the rest. Do you think in a similar way that the best explanation of the usefulness of something like the intentional stance is that it's glomming on to real things in the world, goals, desires, motivations, and all
So,
that?
can you hold the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Oh, yeah. Did you hear me?
Just the last sentence.
Do you think similarly that the intentional stance is useful, at least in part, because it's glomming onto real things in the world like desires, motivations, and plans? And if so, what are those things on the sort of models that you're talking about? Because I understand how these things are predictive, but I don't understand how they are goal making. It's hard for me to see that.
Well, there's a whole set of views here of philosophers arguing about what the status of those things are. And I think for my purposes, I don't have to commit to any particular metaphysical take on that. I'm inclined to be sort of a hardcore pragmatist naturalist about it. So I feel like belief talk, I mean, for the record, I don't think beliefs are real things. But belief talk, desire talk, goal talk is all a very useful and powerful way to understand the world at a certain level. That if I'm trying to, understand the behavior of this object, I could go down to the quantum level, and it would take a lot of work to do all the quantum computations about, this blob of matter here.
Less for me than for some.
But if I adopt the intentional stance and zoom up to sort of everyday room size objects, and I treat this thing as having thoughts, beliefs, a mind, and so on, I can make really fast work of all that quantum computation that would be really difficult. So I can answer yes to your question. Yes, I think intentional stance level talk is glomming on to the real world. And that's a really useful tool for explaining the behavior of these things. And for the same reason it's useful for me to understand Garrett, to adopt it, it's going to be useful for AI systems to have some capacity like that to understand us. That's a great question.
Going off of what JC said.
Who's talking?
I am talking. Sorry. Going off of what JC said, if we do adopt the intentional stance for modeling the awareness of AI systems, would then there be a way where we would kind of prioritize the needs and goals of people over the needs and goals of our AI, or we have to implement some sort of 3-law system? Would we have to build that in with the weighted nodes that you were talking about, or?
Yeah.
What's your take on that, sir?
Right. So, first off, I've been kind of value neutral about the worries, the ethical concerns, the various moral issues that might come up here. And the way that people in this area talk about this is the value alignment problem. Because if you build one of these and it's too smart, or its intelligence vastly exceeds ours, and it has goals, whatever they might be, it's going to, its existence might not be compatible with ours, to put it mildly, right? I mean, there's people worried about sort of, global existential risk, that were you to get a super intelligent AI, it's all over because this thing is going to pursue its goals, whatever they might be, with ruthless efficiency, and we may just get eaten up in the process. Okay, so that's a problem that comes on the scene once you get super intelligent AI, which I've suggested this might be a step in that direction. And the whole question of how do we deal with control, how do we deal with the value alignment problem is a very big and interesting set of questions, right? So we've got to figure out how to do that. I don't have a simple, obvious suggestion for you yet. I mean, I can point you in the direction of a bunch of literature. The book to read here is Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. That's the word on this right now. And that's the one that got Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates and a bunch of other people really clinched up about this problem and got them got them saying things like, you need to read this book now. Ariana?
My question is kind of more just for a fun thought, maybe a positive thought, is given your shirt for Occupy Mars and your talk that, a plan for conscious AI, do you think we can, our desires to go out and explore the universe and travel further than we ever have before in the cosmos or even within our solar system, do you think AI can actually be the first ones out furthest rather than humans, given that we have biological restrictions that AI can actually supplement?
Well, I guess we're already doing that. If you think of the Mars rover as being an AI, it's operating autonomously and it's solving problems on its own. So we've already colonized other planets with AI systems.
Maybe once we
Pretty dumb ones, though.
accomplish our C2, is maybe we can actually even communicate with these,
Yeah.
structures in a way that we can potentially actually
Yeah.
expand the human race. But first, we need to take the C2 AI machine out into a
Yeah, well, they can go lots of places that your meatbag body won't go well and do lots of things that you can't do. And also, we can use them to clean up nuclear reactor meltdowns and, maybe that's going to start the AI robot revolution. But, yeah, there's lots of things. I mean, the motive structure here is that, obviously, if we can build things with increasing levels of autonomy or increasing capacities to solve problems, they can be this incredible tool to just solve, there's just all the money on the planet is there waiting to be had. So there's massive motivation for people to build a good AI system that can, for instance, cure cancer or whatever, right? So whether you like it or not, there's lots of people working hard to build smarter and smarter systems. That can't be all the questions.
We have one more question.
Hey.
All right. So human minds seem to fail to develop a sense of morals if they don't become part of a community. So it seems like the
I don't know if I believe that.
Well,
Sorry.
Well, super AIs, it seems like the main problem with the super AI is that if it prioritizes its goals and desires over that of all other goals and desires, or the goals and desires of other people, that seems to be what would lead it to, wolves walk all over humankind.
Yes.
So how can we design AIs with some sort of sense of morals that appreciates the goals and aspirations of other thinking creatures?
I don't know. It's a really hard problem. You've got a limbic system and an amygdala, and you've got an organic cognitive system that evolved over millions of years that's very similar to mine, and it makes you and me really compatible. And it makes a lot of my goals and your goals compatible for the most part, and we can get along, and the social interactions work out really well. And then we make minor tweaks here and there to adjust. And when you introduce new cognitive agents that have been severed from that evolutionary history that endowed all of us with kind of compatible sets of aligned values, and you make it super intelligent, you've got a really possibly scary combination here. It's there having the power and intelligence to pursue those goals with such efficiency that's dangerous for us, and lacking those kinds of similar values to us. So that's a big, hard problem. Lots of money going into this problem right now. There's lots of research being done on it. I'd encourage you to go look at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute website down in Berkeley. There's OpenAI project that Elon Musk has put a bunch of money into. There's a handful of other foundations where the AI value alignment problem is first and foremost in their list of priorities every day. They're coming in trying to think about how to solve this.
That just made me think of one other thing. Since humans, oftentimes, we change our behavior in response to the way we think others will view us, do you think we could design an AI that changes its behavior in response to the way others view it?
Well, the bigger problem here is that once you give it C2, once you make it aware and it can model itself, like I can, so I can think to myself, I don't know enough about Newcomb's paradox. Garrett always talks about it. and I always think, oh, fuck, what is Newcomb's paradox again? And I try to remember it. So I recognize about my own abilities and my capacities and my knowledge that there's lots of things I don't know. And the thing is, my capacity to fix myself is somewhat limited. There's only so much I can learn. You know, there's a lot of coffee to drink and parties to go to and other things to do. So imagine then having the ability to improve myself and my capacities and being really smart about it and redesign my own cognitive structure. So you say, well, let's build it so that it has a certain set of dispositions or it prioritizes certain things. But if you make it smart enough and you really make it autonomous and you have it be aware in this more robust sense, then it's going to rewire itself. It's going to rebuild itself. The same way I rebuild myself, the way you're rebuilding yourself by taking a course. I'm going to learn calculus, right? And learning calculus or learning about Newcomb's paradox facilitates my achieving my other primary goals. So I'm highly motivated to do that. And if an AI system can do that with incredible efficiency, hence you get the sort of AI go boom problem of superintelligence unfolding as a result of its, hardwiring in certain goal structures turns out to be hard. It's going to want to make itself super intelligent so it can achieve whatever sort of thing you thought you were, whatever sort of safe goal you thought you were going to give it.
Wow. So then controlling an deviant AI is even more difficult than controlling deviant people in society.
Yeah, right. Imagine somebody with Ted Bundy's, sociopathy. Imagine someone with a complete disregard for other people's feelings. And, the only thing that's saving most of us from lots of people like that is that they're not very good at what they do, right? Imagine a super intelligent serial killer. If they've got different goal structures, and the only thing that's saving most of us is the fact that they just aren't very competent at acquiring the means to achieve their ends. So that gets worrisome about AI systems. Is that it?